Thank you very much, Madam Chair, my fellow panelists and gentlemen. It's nice to speak in the middle, and I'll probably reflect on what the middle riparian role is, given the fact that being an upper riparian exhibits tremendous hydrohegemony. And therefore my paper reflects a bit on some of the prospects and challenges of a very important skill and tool that we all have to develop between states, and that's hydrodiplomacy. And this is in the context of a serious issue that is gaining a lot of currency, an issue that propels us to think in various different ways, and that is water itself. And across the globe, everywhere, I think people are discussing this issue quite deeply. CSCAP, of course, as mentioned, has picked up this issue for the first time, much to China's reluctance, but I guess they too feel that a little water dialogue is not harmful at all. So we see many numerous reports coming out on the water issues, but I think we have to be a little careful on what water security means, what water insecurity means, and whether water scarcity is actually a constructed concept, or is it more about proper water management. And these are some essence which I will touch upon and bring to the table when I discuss the prospects and challenges of hydrodiplomacy in about 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, we're looking at transboundary waters, and I think it's the largest shared resource in the world. There are about 263 lakes and rivers that states share, and that's about 145 states in the world share this very vital resource. It's a resource which has no substitute, so it makes the resource very vital. It occupies almost about 45% of the Earth's surface and covers about 40% of the global population. So you can immediately sense that this very critical, vital resource called water has a great deal of activity around it. And not surprisingly, therefore, states have tended to look at water and shape their relationship since 3,500 years ago. And though the water war thesis has gained a lot of currency of late, states have exhibited more elements of cooperation, understanding, and framed a neat riparian sensibility amongst their basins. Since the last 60 years, probably there's only been about 35 disputes surrounding the fresh water. There's been about 140 odd treaties or arrangements, which clearly shows that there's been a great deal of cooperation. But the absence of war does not mean that there would not be conflict in the future, and that I think we should be aware of. Water needs to be viewed from a very exponential kind of a relationship. As the population increases, the demand for food will increase, the demand for energy will equally increase, and we'll find that there will be this the criticality of the resource will obviously go up the ladder. But states are rational egoists. They tend to contribute far more positive kind of institutions and set up kind of mechanism to deal with a vital resource, and we've seen it in the last 50 years. The Mekong Basin countries continue to cooperate amongst each other in spite of the Vietnam War. Since 1955, Israel and Jordan continue to have water dialogue in spite of the two states legally being in war. 1960, the Indus Water Treaty is a classic case of how this kind of mechanism, this regime and treaty has worked very positively in spite of the two wars. The same exists in the Nile River Basin. We find that the 10 basin countries continue to cooperate at certain levels in spite of high suspicion and mistrust. And the same goes with the Niger River Basin. So as I said, cooperation seems to be the momentum around river basins, and this has to be noted when we frame hydrodiplomacy in the future. However, treaties which were formed earlier does not necessarily mean that it will hold value in the future. And that's where the criticality of water security issue comes in. The issue is not seeped in as much today as it is 20, 30 years hence. And there are two elements that determine this long vision of what water security is. The first, of course, is the exponential function, as I mentioned. The demand will obviously increase, population will increase, energy requirement will increase, and therefore the pressure on this very vital resource will increase. The other, of course, is the factor of climate change, which will obviously propel a different set of assessments on what your water resource requirements are going to be. The initial assessments suggest that there would be a large volume of water because of the glacial melting, particularly in the belts of the Himalayan glaciers. Then, of course, there will be a long sequence of droughts which will emerge. So the climate change impact on the hydrological system would be a very important determinant of the water security issue in the future. Now, there are instruments around the world which determine state relationship and frames much of hydro diplomacy. One, of course, is the 1997 UN Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, a very vital treaty. In the sense, it's not a treaty, it's not a force in action yet because it hasn't been ratified. It requires 35 parties to ratify it. We're around about 22. Still a long way to go. But some of the principles are noted, and I think these principles determine bilateral or multilateral relationship among states. And these are equitable and reasonable use, which can be very debatable in terms of state sovereignty, and obligation not to cause significant harm. And these are two very vital principles on which generally the treaties are formulated. And then, of course, it's up to countries themselves to spell out precisely what these terms, these norms mean. And then the politics determines how you frame treaties between the right periods. Recently, we've also looked, international law has also looked at the aquifers. This is the invisible water that we have, not much talked about, but this will be a crucial element in the future as well. And the same values and norms are prescribed. Sovereignty of aquifer states, equitable and reasonable utilization, obligation not to cause significant harm, obligation to cooperate, and that's again a very fundamental key element of water resource, to cooperate, to find ways, to institute mechanism, to think in a positive and constructive way. And then this element of protecting the ecosystem is probably a new knowledge added to the way we look at water resources these days. Earlier, it was thought more from the supply side perspective, where the engineers and the hydrologists drilled deep into the riverbeds and thought in terms of the supply chain for it, given little attention to what the demand side meant. And I think we have realized over the last 50, 60 years of intense development and a high rate of water use and the abuse, that the supply side concept needs to be ebbed down a bit. And we have to also look on the demand side perspective, how we utilize the water, how do we change our agricultural pattern if required. So these elements would be required. And also the ecosystem, the centrality of the ecosystem in our whole concept of water resource issues is very fundamental now. I think we need to vitally protect the environment surrounding the water system as well. And therefore we talk about the environmental flow that needs to be maintained. And that's a very crucial element indeed for our future way of looking at water issues. But if you look at many of the treaties, and probably this slide isn't big enough, I think much of the treaties earlier, and there are about 3,500 odd treaties since 2,500 years, much revolved around navigation and rivers forming the border and the territorial line between two countries. Much of the future treaties will revolve around two things. That is, A, sharing the benefits, that is hydropower, would be a crucial element of the treaties which will form between states in the future. Another is how do you distribute the water, the sharing of the water, and the sharing of the benefits are going to be two elements that will determine the treaties in the future. And both these elements carry a great deal of emotion, carry a great deal of politics, and carry a great deal of divisiveness around it. And that is where the management would come in, the management which can be defined as hydrodiplomacy. If you look at this, the expanse of the globe, you find clearly the red spots are the critical areas where scarcity would come about if not properly managed. And I use scarcity in a very different way here. I always believe that scarcity will come about if water is not managed well. So there is this great space of managing your water resources and not blowing up the scarcity thesis to propel people to take certain adverse action, for example like war. But you do see very around this globe certain circle areas which needs to be noted, and these are going to be the critical areas. One, of course, primarily up on the north is China. China's need of water is enormous, and one cannot deny that. It's a thirsty country, and it's so equally a hungry country. So, the food requirement in China would drive its water requirement as well, and that will largely determine much of the riparian politics existing in that region. And I'll come to the fact that how South Asia has to be looked at from a hydrological perspective and not just a defined territorial perspective. So what does the water sector tell us? First, there is no substitute for water. Second, there are issues of quality and health which we'll have to keep in mind. We often talk about water insecurity in the sense of the quantity of flow and the reduced quantity of flow, but we have to also look at the quality and the health element of water. There are almost 1.1 billion people who suffer from diarrhea. In fact, the entire Millennium Development Goal is to reduce the number of children dying for waterborne diseases. Half of the hospital beds around the globe are filled with patients suffering from waterborne diseases. So the health is a very important element. The quality element of water cannot be disregarded, because you're going to invest a lot in clean supply of water. Clean water and sanitation is going to be a critical part of your entire spending. Third, of course, as I said, water has to be viewed from as an exponential function. And then, to frame all these challenges would require framing new mechanisms and approaches, which is, of course, hydrodiplomacy. So the key geopolitical question, which we have to really be looking at, is that obviously water carries a huge and a great deal of preciousness about it. And preciousness is often translated in state politics into possessiveness. States do tend to possess a vital resource and a precious resource called water. And that often leads to a certain aggressiveness, which you might notice across some of the river basins around the world. If you look at the Tigris and Euphrates, you might look at Turkey's hydropolitics, and you'll find elements of aggressiveness and elements of softness in its approach to regional diplomacy. If you look at China, you might look at it from a certain aggressive approach now. If you look at Egypt, there is obviously an element of a lower riparian dictating the proceedings on the Nile Basin. And if you look at Israel and Jordan, you'll find these elements of resource aggressiveness of states, because, like it or not, water is instrumentally a very internal, interest-oriented resource, and people would like to protect that first before actually sharing it. Water security and insecurity are two different things in this paper. I relate water insecurity in terms of availability, reliability, and quality, and water security relates to insecurity arising from control of the headwaters. And that's very important in riparian politics. Who controls the headwaters determines largely the politics around the basin, and therefore it's not surprising that lower riparian countries tend to be aggrieved or concerned or show a lot of angst when an upper riparian tends to build a dam or a barrage. As I explained, Turkey is a good example of seeing how it evolves politics around it, but I think largely hydrodiplomacy would also depend upon what hydrohegemony is all about in the basin, and I have touched upon this in my paper, which I'll quickly touch upon here. Now, hydrohegemony in a way explains the power asymmetry between states in a river basin, and that's very important to understand, because that will help frame the right kind of diplomacy that is required. And it helps us to ask the question, why does Turkey as an upper riparian, for example, does what it does on the river Tigris and Euphrates, while Ethiopia, again being an upper riparian on the Nile, does not possibly do anything? So obviously the issue has to relate to power play and power asymmetry. How is it that the Palestinians living on the west bank of the Jordan River cannot approach the river, much less pump from it? So obviously there is a great deal of power play in the basin going on, which we need to understand, and that is where the hydrohegemony concept comes in, which is a way of looking at river basins these days, developed by many people around the globe. It essentially means hegemony at river basin level, achieved through water resource control strategies. I think the key word here is control strategies, such as resource capture, integration, and containment. Obviously, the hydrohegemony exists where there is a great deal of asymmetry of power, and the consolidation of a hydrohegemon and you can mark some of the hydrohegemony around the river basin. Turkey could be one of them, Israel another, Egypt another, leads to a certain competition over water. Obviously, the power asymmetry is dominated by one of the states who kind of are the custodian of the river basin, and that essentially comes from the power which has been defined, either it's structural power in terms of the military, financial power that they have, or in the sense of the bargaining power that the state has, or in the sense of the ideological power that the state has. They can really determine who the hegemon is in the river basin, and therefore they can frame the riparian relationship accordingly. So what does this hydrohegemon theory or thesis tell us? It tells us a great deal, I think, of how states operate in various different river basins. Where water is physically scarce, the interaction could be expected to be a competition for control of a greater volume of water. So you have to note down some of the basins around the world with the physical scarcity of water extremely high. We'll find the competition increasing dramatically. Where there's abundance of water, there too is a problem then. One riparian may seek to control the flows for hydropower, while another may seek control of flood management purposes. So there's a conflict here as well. And in certain cases, control of the resource may be relinquished to achieve politically affiliated non-water goals. So obviously water then becomes a trade-off, and it becomes an important part of the politics around it. So generally three situations emerges on river basins around the globe. One, of course, is the engagement of sharing this resource, which leads to some form of cooperation. Another is a consolidation of the riparian position, which allows minimum cooperation between states. Another, of course, is the extreme end, where resource becomes contested, and therefore the competition is very, very fierce. Now, each hegemon displays a certain amount of positivity and certain amount of negativity, and it's up to you to really see which hegemon is a positive hegemon and which hegemon is a negative one. And one can argue whether at this stage of water development in China, whether China is a negative hegemon or not. That's open to debate, of course, but largely there is a certain positive leadership role that a hegemon can play in a river basin. And I think you can take examples here. Probably you can take an example of India in its relationship with India. I think there is a certain positive leadership role that India has played in framing the Indus Water Treaty and to bring in a certain stable situation in the river basin. Of course, there's a negative dominant form of hegemony which states do display from time to time, and that essentially leads to a lot of unstable hydro relationship. So much of the river basins have treaties, of course, as I said, about 145 since the last 60 years, but many of them are quite bilateral in nature, and that essentially puts two states and their emotions and their politics pitted against one another. So there's also a great deal of asymmetric power relationship involved when bilateral treaties are formed. What is missing in the basin approach these days is the multilateral kind of treaty, and obviously there's no multilateral treaty existing, or very limited multilateral treaty, because power parity is very difficult to achieve. And therefore when you're looking at South Asia and this approach to a rather multilateral basin approach of states, you'll find the whole situation quite difficult. We'll just focus on South Asia itself. I think it's important to look at South Asia from a hydrological perspective. This is the great basin belt, which you can call the Himalayan basin belt. Has a large chunk of population, great deal of agricultural activity. There's this great interconnect of food, energy and water, and therefore the value of water is increasingly high. Also, China becomes an important riparian country in this whole hydrological situation, and the way it shapes its water policy will greatly affect much of the water policies of the other countries. China, of course, has never signed on the 1997 UN non-navigation treaty. It doesn't need to. It's the supreme upper riparian. Turkey has also not signed on it. But I think Turkey's approach is completely different from China's approach at this moment. I think China needs its water. It's going to rapidly develop what it can from the Tibet belt, and probably the idea of the low riparian here is to draw China into some sort of a water dialogue or some sort of understanding in which we know what Chinese are doing. It's very difficult really to draw them in given the nature of the international law here. But I think there is a thrust towards getting China on board, and I think CSCAP reflects a certain element of that water dialogue with China, to know what the Chinese are doing. I think future treaties largely, and I think I'll probably wrap up here, future treaties in the next 20 to 30 years will require revisiting some of the earlier treaties that one has signed, given the fact that their new hydrological knowledge is coming in, and also the impact of climate change. Secondly, I think these treaties will have to be recalculated and revisited, bringing in the demand side perspective as well. And I think in dealing with China, I think each basin in this region, the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin region and of course the Mekong region, will have to deal with it in a very clinical and different ways, I think. For the GBM, I think there's a two-pronged approach that India needs to do. It needs to put forward its middle riparian position, because with the Brahmaputra, India does become a middle riparian, and therefore Bangladesh needs to be brought into this basin equation, which also brings in China. And on the other front, I think there has to be a forceful approach in a way of a water dialogue with China. Try to bring in China to the table to discuss what the Chinese are doing. And here I think the critical element of any treaty with China would mean sharing of hydrological information, sharing of hydrological data, and that has to be defined quite clearly. I think at the end I would say that hydrodiplomacy would frame much of the state politics in many of the river basins around the world, more so in South Asia. And I think one has to place the internal water dynamics of a country as well into a larger external policy. We have to take in the calculation of the ecosystem as a unit and protect it. And also, largely, I think we'll have to move towards a more demand side way of looking at our water resources, and not simply from a supply side dam building and barrages way of looking at water resources. So I'll end here and look forward to questions from you. Thank you.